David Copperfield. Chapter 1. Mr. Merstone. I disliked Mr. Merstone the first time I met him. Perhaps I was just jealous, or perhaps it was more than that. Certainly, he was a handsome gentleman with dark hair and dark whiskers, but there was something in his eyes that made me feel uneasy. He began to call at our house, and then my mother started putting on her prettiest dresses and going out in the evenings. On such evening, my nurse, Peggotty, suggested that I go with her to visit her brother in Yarmouth for a fortnight. I agreed immediately, happy at the thought of an adventure. I did not realize how different things would be on my return. The day of our departure soon arrived, and Peggotty and I climbed into the carrier's cart that was to take us to Yarmouth. My mother and I kissed each other, and we both cried. When the cart started off, she ran after it to ask for another kiss. As we rode away, I saw Mr. Merstone speak to her disapprovingly, and she lowered her head submissively. I shall never forget that holiday. Peggotty's nephew, Ham, was waiting for us when the cart set us down. He swung me on his broad shoulders and took us to their home. The Peggottys lived in a boat that had been taken from the water and made into a small cozy home. For a young boy like me, it was magical. My nurse's brother, Mr. Peggotty, greeted us warmly and introduced little Emily, his niece. Both she and Ham were orphans. She was about my age, with blue eyes and curls, and I quickly became devoted to her. When it was time for me to leave, we were both inconsolable. As we approached home, however, I became excited about seeing my mother again. She was not at the gate to greet me, and Peggotty led me into the kitchen. Now I was worried. "Where is Mamma, Peggotty? What has happened? She isn't dead, is she, like Papa?" Tears filled my eyes. "Good gracious! No, Mr. Davy," she replied, shocked. "But there is something I must tell you. You have a new Pa. Come and see him, and your Mamma." We went into the best parlor. My mother was sitting on one side of the fireplace, and Mr. Merstone sat on the other side. As soon as she saw me, my mother smiled and hugged me timidly. "Now, Carla, control yourself," Mr. Merstone said. She kissed me, avoiding looking at me under Mr. Murdstone's watchful eye. As soon as I could, I went to my room. Miserable, I thought of how different things used to be, how loving and affectionate my mother had been under Peggotty's indulgent eye. I knew that happy life was over, and I cried myself to sleep. I was awoken by my mother and Peggotty, who had been looking for me. "Davy, what is the matter?" my mother asked. She tried to put her arms around me, but I pushed her away. "Oh, this is your fault, Peggotty," she cried. "You have turned my boy against me." I heard other footsteps, and Mr. Merstone entered. "Carla, my dear, remember yourself." "Oh, it's too much," my mother exclaimed. "Can I not have some peace and happiness?" Mr. Merstone calmed her with a kiss, and saw immediately that she would do whatever he said. "Go downstairs while David and I talk. We'll join you shortly." he said with a smile. When we were alone, he asked me, "Do you know what I do with a disobedient dog?" "I beat it." He gave me a hard look, and I understood all too well. "Now, come downstairs and do not displease your mother or me again." After dinner that evening, Mr. Murdstone's sister arrived. She was dark like him, with the same stern look, but had a large nose and thick eyebrows which almost met in the middle. She had come to help my mother, and started the next morning by rearranging all our store cupboards. From then on she took control of everything. On the one occasion that my mother asked to be consulted occasionally, Mr. Murdstone accused her of being ungrateful and expressed his disappointment. It was enough. My mother never protested again. I resumed my lessons with my mother, but these were no longer the happy times they had been before. Mr. and Miss Merstone were always present, always ready to criticize my mother for her lack of firmness with me and myself of every mistake. Mr. Merstone made me nervous and forgetful. My mother in turn became anxious. When she thought no one was looking, she tried to help me, but was immediately rebuked by Miss Merstone. My poor mother suffered as much as I did, if not more. This continued for several months, until one morning I entered the parlor for my lessons and saw my mother looking more nervous than usual. Mr. Merstone was holding a cane in his hand. "Now, David, you must be very careful over your lessons today," he said. The effect was, of course, that I became particularly forgetful and things went from worse to worse. Finally, my mother burst into tears. "David, you and I will go upstairs," Mr. Murdstone said, taking my arm. My mother ran after us, but Miss Merstone stopped her. My mother's crying accompanied me up the stairs. When we got to my room, Mr. Merstone suddenly put my head under his arm and raised the cane in his other hand. "Please, sir, don't beat me. I'll do better." "Really?" he replied, and hit me hard. The hand holding me was near my mouth, and I beat it. He beat me then again and again with renewed fury. I heard my mother and Peggotty crying outside the door, and then it was over. He left me and locked the door behind him. I was kept in my room for 5 days. The only person I saw was Miss Murdstone, who brought me food but never spoke to me. On the 5th evening, I heard whispering at my door. "Davy, my darling." It was Peggotty. "Oh, Peggotty," I cried. "Shh, or they will hear us." "My lonely, listen, you are going away to school tomorrow." Chapter 2. School. I left after breakfast the following morning. My mother, her eyes red from crying, embraced me and told me to be good. Then Miss Merstone took me to the awaiting cart. It was the same carrier that had taken Peggotty and myself to Yarmouth. I cried heartily as we drove away. Then, about half a mile from the house, Peggotty suddenly appeared from behind a hedge and got into the cart. She hugged me tightly, put some cakes into my pockets, and got out again, all without saying a word. I felt a little happier after this, and even more so when I found 2 half-crowns wrapped in paper, sent with my mother's love. As the morning progressed, I shared my cakes with the carrier and learned that his name was Mr. Barkis. He asked a few questions about Peggotty and then asked me to give her a message when I wrote to her. "What message is that, Mr. Barkis?" I asked. "Tell her Barkis is willing," he replied. I thought it a strange message, but kept the thought to myself. I very soon fell asleep. Mr. Barkis set me down at the inn in Yarmouth where, after some dinner, I took the stagecoach to London. We travelled through the night, and I sat pressed in between two gentlemen. Unlike the other passengers, I was unable to sleep. We arrived in London. The next morning, nobody was waiting for me at the inn, so the coachman left me in the booking office. I began to think I might never be claimed, and that perhaps this was Mr. Murdstone's revenge, when a thin young man entered. His name was Mr. Mell, and he was a schoolmaster at my new school. Salem House was unwelcoming, square brick building. As we crossed the courtyard, I remarked to Mr. Mell how quiet it was. He seemed surprised. "Copperfield, don't you know it is the school holidays? There are no boys here except you." Mr. Mell left me in the classroom for a while. It was a soulless, dirty, long room which smelled stale and unhealthy. I walked up and down the rows of desks, noticing the scraps of paper on the floor and the ink splashed liberally about. At one end of the room, I saw a beautiful written sign lying on a desk. It said, "Be careful, he bites." I imagined it was for a fierce dog and felt rather alarmed, so I quickly climbed up onto the neighboring desk and proceeded to peer under other desks in search of it. When Mr. Mell returned, he found me like this and asked me what I was doing. "I'm looking for the dog, sir," I replied. He looked at me gravely. "I'm sorry, Copperfield," he said. "It's for you. I've been instructed to make you wear it." He helped me down from the desk and put the sign over my head so that it hung on my back. How mortified I was! How I suffered! I was glad there was nobody to see it. As the days and weeks passed, I began to dread the end of the holidays, but it was inevitable. Preparations were made for the boys' return, and one morning it was announced that the headmaster, Mr. Creakle, would return that evening. After supper, I was summoned before him. Mr. Creakle, who was almost completely bald, had an angry face with small eyes and nose and a large chin. He never spoke above a whisper, and judging by the veins protruding on his forehead, the effort cost him dearly. "I know your stepfather, boy," he said, as I stood before him, "and I know something about you. You bite." I lowered my head, and he continued, "Let me tell you something about myself. I'm a Tartar, and very determined. I do my duty and make sure what I want done is done. Nobody stands in my way. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, sir," I replied, trembling under his fiery gaze. "Good. Now go," he replied. I hurried away as quickly as possible. The first boy I met was Stormy. He found the sign on my back so amusing that he immediately introduced me to all the other boys as they arrived back. However, the most important introduction took place in the playground and was to a boy some 6 years older than myself, who was respected and admired by all the boys in the school. Steerforth, for this was his name, asked me why I had to wear the sign, and hearing my story, declared it was a shame. I became devoted to him immediately, and he took me under his wing. School was a sorry business. Mr. Creakle was indeed a Tartar, and took great delight in using his cane. He seemed to particularly enjoy canning the chubbier boys, and a day never passed without poor Traddles receiving a beating. The only exception was Steerforth, whom Mr. Creakle never raised his cane to. The months passed, and finally the holidays came, and I went home. I was so excited to see my mother and Peggotty. My mother was sitting in the parlor when I arrived. With the baby in her arms, she looked thinner and more fragile than before, although still pretty. On seeing me, she got up to embrace me. "Davy, my boy, I'm so happy to see you. This is your little brother," she said, showing me the baby. Peggotty came running in then and held me to her. "Oh, Master Davy, let me look at you." That evening was the best day of the holiday. Mr. and Miss Merstone were not at home, and we three all dined together. I told them about Mr. Creakle and Steerforth, and we talked and laughed. I almost believed Mr. Merstone did not exist until we heard the door open later on. My mother suggested I went to bed quickly. Mr. Merstone did not approve of going to bed late. I said good night and slipped out of the room. The next morning, Mr. Merstone was sitting in the parlor. I approached fearfully and apologized for biting him. He accepted my apology coldly, but nothing changed between us. The rest of the holidays were quite miserable. Whenever I entered the room, in the middle of conversation, Mr. Merstone or his sister stopped speaking and became serious, while my mother looked anxiously from one to the other. I therefore tried to remain out of the way and sat silently through meals. This behavior drew criticism, too, and if my mother attempted weakly to defend me, she was also rebuked. Finally, the day came to return to school. My mother came to the gate to say goodbye. When I was sitting in the cart, she held up the baby for me to see and stood that way as we drove away. I did not know it, but this would be my last image of her. Now I must relate the saddest time of my life. My birthday was about 2 months after my return to school. After breakfast, I was told to go to the parlor. I imagined that Peggotty or my mother had sent something for me, but was conscious of something like pity in the schoolmaster's eyes. Mr. Creakle was still at the breakfast table when I arrived, but he quickly left the room. His wife sat me down beside her and, with a sad look, took my hand. "My poor boy, sit beside me. I'm afraid I have some very sad news. Your mother has died." I cried long and hard while Mrs. Creakle held me. The news quickly spread through the school, and I had the bitter satisfaction of a new-found statue among the boys. Chapter 3. Everything Changes. And so the worst period of my life began. I was sent home the next day, but any hope I had of finding much comfort there was immediately dashed. Mr. Merstone ignored my presence entirely and sat consumed by his own grief, while his sister busied herself with practical matters. I saw little of Peggotty except at night, when she sat by my bed and offered me the only comfort I found under that roof. The time before the funeral is confused in my memory, but I remember the day itself clearly. I can still see the best parlor ready it for mourners, and later the coffin containing my mother and baby brother as it was lowered into the ground. That evening, Peggotty came to my room. She held me close and told me that my mother had died in her arms, her last thoughts of me. The baby had died the following day. The first thing Miss Merstone did after the funeral was over was to give Peggotty a month's notice. Poor Peggotty was as upset as I was at the thought of our separation. After her departure, I was almost entirely neglected. I ate with the Merstones when they were at home, alone when they were not. Mr. Merstone tried to see as little of me as possible, my presence perhaps irritating his conscience. And I spent many lonely hours, weeks, months. Peggotty now married to Mr. Barkis, come to visit as often as she was allowed, but it was never often enough. Then, one day, Mr. Merstone decided I should be sent to work in his business in London. I was 10 years old. Merstone and Grimby's warehouse was in Blackfriars, on the water front. It was an old building, overrun with rats. My job, along with 4 other boys, was to wash, label and pack the bottles of wine the warehouse shipped overseas. For this, I received 6 shillings a week. Lodgings were arranged for me with Mr. Micawber, who I was introduced to on my first day. He was a rotund middle-aged man with a shiny bald head. His clothes were shabby, yet he had an air of kindness. Mr. Micawber lived with his wife and 4 children in a house which was as shabby as he was. I worked from morning to night, and spent all my earnings on my breakfast and supper, which was often an inadequate affair. I was quite miserable at work, feeling the full shame of my situation and the divide between myself and the other men and boys there. I had no friends, so I became attached to the Micawber family. Mrs. Micawber freely confided all of her husband's financial problems to me and enlisted my service in selling household possessions. Thus I bore not only my own misery, but also my worries for this kind family. Finally, Mr. Micawber's problems reached a crisis. Unable to repay his creditors, he was arrested and taken to a debtor's prison. Soon afterwards, the family furniture was sold, and Mrs. Micawber and the children moved into his cell with him. I did not want to be separated from the only family I knew in London, so lodgings were found for me near the prison. After several weeks, Mr. Micawber was released from prison, and we were all reunited. However, he decided to leave London and wasted very little time in preparations. We spent their last evening together, and Mr. Micawber offered me some fatherly advice. "My dear Copperfield," he said, "learn from my mistakes. Never put off until tomorrow what you can do today." I promised not to. After my friends left, I felt I could bear it no longer at Merstone and Grimby's, and a plan formed in my mind. I would run away. I remembered my mother telling me about my father's aunt, Betsy Trustwood, disappointed that I was a boy and not a girl. She had severed all ties with my mother at my birth. Despite this, I decided to find her and ask for her help. I shall not relate my journey, how I was robbed almost immediately of my possessions, how I walked all day and slept in fields at night, selling my jacket and waistcoat in order to buy food. It is enough to say that 6 days after I left London, I arrived, exhausted, starving, and half-clothed in Dover, and began to inquire after my aunt. I was lucky, and after no more than half a day, I was following her maid along a cliff road to the pretty cottage in which my aunt lived. There, aware of my terrible appearance, my courage failed. Having stood outside for a while, I was intending to leave when an elderly lady came out of the cottage. She was wearing gardening gloves and a handkerchief over her bonnet, and held a large knife in her hand. "Go away! I'll have no boys here," she said angrily before turning away. I approached and, timidly touching her, said, "Please, ma'am, I'm your nephew, David Copperfield." "Good gracious!" she exclaimed, sitting down quickly. A series of emotions passed across her face. I hurriedly told her all my story and then burst into tears. Seeing this, she took me by the collar, led me into the cottage, and laid me on the sofa. She then instructed her maid, Janet, to ask Mr. Dick to come downstairs. Soon afterwards, a grey-haired gentleman appeared. "Mr. Dick, do you remember my nephew, David Copperfield?" she asked him. "Well, this is his son, and he's run away. What should we do?" Mr. Dick considered for a moment and then said, "Give him a bath." And so I was bathed, fed, and much restored, put to bed. The following morning I entered the parlor feeling quite hopeful. My aunt was an honest woman, but not unkind. Perhaps she would let me stay with her. "Good morning, David," she said. "I have written to your stepfather and told him to come." "Oh, must I go back?" I asked, my voice falling. "I haven't decided. We shall see," she replied. My hopes died. On the morning Mr. Merstone came, we were sitting in the parlor. Aunt Betsy suddenly saw a lady on a donkey approach the house. My aunt never allowed donkeys on the grounds, and angrily shook her fist at the rider from the window. Recognizing Miss Merstone, I quickly informed my aunt of the rider's identity. "I don't care!" she cried, and ran outside, shaking her fist again. Mr. Merstone was walking up behind his sister. They both looked at my aunt in surprise. She ignored them and chased away the boy leading the donkey. Then she marched back into the house, and waiting for Janet, they announced the visitors. "Miss Trustwood," said Mr. Merstone on entering. "I have come to take this ungrateful boy back." "Really, David, are you ready to leave?" my aunt asked me. "No, they never liked me, and made Mamma unhappy about me too. Please don't send me back with them. I was so miserable," I exclaimed. "This is ridiculous," said Miss Merstone indignantly. "I wonder, would you treat your own son like this and send him to work?" my aunt asked Miss Merstone. "I can do what I like with the boy. I must warn you, Miss Trustwood, if you decide to keep him, I shall close my door to him forever," Mr. Merstone said sternly. "So be it. I shall take my chances with him." "Good day to you both," my aunt replied coldly. "Janet, show them out." Furious, the Merstone marched out of the house and out of my life.